Hi everyone. We are going to start to look at a category of faiths that we will call the Abrahamic faiths. The first of these Abrahamic faiths is Judaism. So just to take a look at the population of Jews throughout the world, um, you know, when I'm with students, sometimes we ask and have kids take a guess of what percentage of the world is Jewish. And sometimes, just because of the settlement patterns in Bucks County, kids have a very inflated concept of how many Jews actually live in the world. And as we can see here, Jews constitute 0.2% of the global population. So it's a very small percentage. Sometimes it might seem, because in the northeastern section of the United States, there is a concentrated population of Jewish people, that there is a generally higher population of Jewish people. But in fact, it is a very small population. And if we look at this global map that looks at the plotting of the main religions practiced in these different geographic regions, we can see that the Jewish category barely shows up anywhere. There are tiny, well, you can't really even see it, pockets in the Northeast, and then Israel as a concentration of Jewish population is included, right? But otherwise, it is an extremely small population. However, historically and culturally, an extremely important and contributing culture that serves as the foundation for these, what we call Abrahamic faiths. So let's get some background on that. So Judaism as a faith is over 5,000 years old. According to the Jewish calendar, we are around the year 5,780. And Judaism is one of our examples of a tribal faith because it is tied to a literal tribe or ethnic group of people known as the Hebrews, right? Which is why I'm sure you know that Hebrew is the language spoken in at synagogue, at certain ceremonies and rituals, and it's the original language of the holy books of Judaism, right? Because it is tied to this group of people whose descendancy is traced back well before the era of the Fertile Crescent. So the Hebrews were a nomadic group of people who were roaming around during the time period of the Foundations era stuff, such as the earliest Sumerians and Hammurabi, right? Very, very ancient. I also want to note that because Judaism is tied to the Hebrew tribe, that when someone is speaking of their ethnicity, right, if you were just to have a casual conversation about where's your family from, what's your ethnic background, right, my answer would be that my ethnic background is Irish and German and Welsh. Someone who is Jewish could say that they are Jewish, and that would be not only an answer to maybe their religion that they participate in, but also their ethnicity, because Judaism is tied to the Hebrew tribe of people. So I want to make that clear. Judaism is the first major monotheistic religion, definitely the region, and as far as everyone can tell through deep study globally, we have moments of the thoughts of monotheism in ancient Egypt and other civilizations, but Judaism is the first to have a sustained and very developed sense of monotheism throughout the world. So what's very essential in Jewish thought, and we'll go through some of the history as to how this has been communicated to followers of Judaism, is that number one, there is one God. And back in the era when this was communicated to the Jews and they began to profess this, we have to realize that it was really controversial to deny the other gods that people believed in the region. Second to this is there's a belief that there's one God who will come again and will come to save all souls and return everyone to a sense of paradise. So another thing that is common in these, or is connected in all these Abrahamic faiths, is the concept of a savior or a messiah, right? Someone who has come to save all people. And we'll see that the difference between some of the Abrahamic faiths is whether or not they are still waiting on a Messiah, or if they believe that the Messiah has come. The basic thread or moral thread of Judaism is that Judaism is concerned with honoring the incorporeal God, right? The idea that God, does not have form. I want you to know as well my spellings here. So since God is so holy and the concept of God is so divine and perfect, in Jewish tradition, you're not supposed to write God's name. That's why you will see practitioners write God G-D, right? Because that way you're not actually writing God's full name. Also, God has many names in Jewish tradition. Some names are far too holy for humans to utter. Some are very common and commonly used in prayer. But a general accepted practice is to not write God's name. Because if you were to throw out that paper, that book that God's name was in, that would be, very disrespectful to God. What's really interesting about Judaism is it's a little bit less concerned with cosmological mysteries, right? So there's less of an emphasis on what happens after you die, right? Why do things happen? Instead, the idea is that all actions in life should reflect the idea of honoring God. So even though we're going to talk about the Ten Commandments and stuff like that, Jewish belief, generally speaking, because there's many different sects of Judaism, but it really is looking at people's actions here on earth and how that best reflects their love and devotion to God. And if you're doing that, then you are leading a good life. And we can really see this in the general accepted belief amongst Jews that there is no permanent state of hell. So there is variation, and we can chat about this when we're all together, especially for those of you who have gone to Hebrew school and know more in-depth information than I. But some groups believe that there is a temporary state of hell, that everyone, it's like you go through and you reflect on your decisions in your life and then you enter heaven. Some believe that hell is actually the way you feel when you're living, when you've done wrong action. It's like the shame that you live in. And others believe like everyone just goes to heaven, or some sense of paradise. And this is, really, again, reflects this idea that Jews are very concerned with understanding God. And that's also why in Jewish tradition, it's really important to ask questions to try to really get at the true nature of God, that it's not disrespectful to question theology and to pose difficult questions to your religious leaders, your rabbis, because the more you question things, the closer you get to the essential nature of God. So there is a tradition of debate, discussion, and education in Judaism that's very rich. So now to talk about the concept of Abraham and why we call this the Abrahamic faith, or all of these religions that ascend from Abraham, the Abrahamic faiths. So Abraham was a patriarch of the Hebrew community during the era of like Mesopotamia, right, over 5,000 years ago. And during that time period, there were many gods that people worshipped. And according to the stories, one day a god appeared to Abraham. God, in this case, we're talking about the God that Christians, Jews, and Muslims all embrace as the one true God. And God makes a covenant with Abraham. And the term covenant is very important in Jewish tradition. A covenant is a promise between God and usually a prophet, that if that prophet or if that person that God has revealed himself to provides a service or relays a message to everyone else, excuse my dog, that God will bestow blessings and uphold certain promises to those individuals. So the covenant that he enters into with Abraham is that if Abraham abandons all the other gods that he was worshiping and only worships God, and that he relays this message to his descendants and gets everyone to abandon the other gods and only worship God, then his descendants will be the chosen people. So first off, this is a very big deal. It's very controversial to abandon the other gods. So it would show faith and bravery when Abraham does so. But there is an issue that happens or that's confronting Abraham, which is that he doesn't currently have any children when this happens. And in fact, he's very old. He and his wife Sarah are very old and they never had children. So they're in this conundrum where they want to believe God, right, that he will have descendants, but it just hasn't happened at that point. And so, they proceed and they are trying to have children, but of course Sarah is very old and they just think it's not going to happen. So they make a difficult decision, which is that Abraham decides that he will have a child by one of his slaves named Hagar. And it happens that once Hagar becomes pregnant, Sarah also becomes pregnant. So already it's kind of showing what happens a lot in what's called the Old Testament, right? The first books of the Holy Bible, which is God kind of testing people's faith. And already Abraham has showed a little bit of lack of faith by having a child with Hagar. So that brings Abraham a lot of shame. So what happens is that he banishes his slave Hagar and the son that she has by him named Ishmael. So he banishes them. Sarah has a child, Isaac. And all of the descendants of Isaac are the Jewish descendants, are considered the chosen people. And Isaac's son Jacob has 12 sons, and they are considered the 12 tribes of Israel. If we follow the line of Judah, eventually we get to the lineage that comes to the life of Jesus of Nazareth, or Jesus Christ. So we can see the lineage of Abraham and Sarah leads to a population of Jewish tribes and eventually to the founder of Christianity. There is also a belief that he had children by Keturah who went east. And I don't know too much about that, and we can chat about that as a group. But one issue I do know is that there's a lot of controversy that arises due to the banishment of Ishmael and Hagar, because there is a belief that Hagar went to other lands where the Arab groups had been living, and that eventually the prophet Muhammad descends from this lineage, which creates resentment between the Jewish lineage and the eventual Muslim lineage. And we can unpack that a little bit more together in class. So, the Jewish people, since they are at this point still nomadic, they eventually begin to migrate towards Egypt because of serious environmental issues in Mesopotamia. So around the year 1800 BCE, there are all these droughts that led to mass migrations out of Mesopotamia, and the Jews settled in Egypt. And for a period of time, things were okay. So there are a lot of stories about the Jews being enslaved in Egypt, and it's true that at some point, many Jews did become slaves. However, there are stories and evidence that early on in the Jewish settlement into Egypt, that there was a lot of coexistence between the Jewish migrants and the Egyptians. And this is noted in the fact that some Jewish individuals were able to rise through the political ranks to have great influence. But regardless, over time, there was cultural tension between the Jews and the Egyptians because of the Jewish insistence and belief in monotheism. The Egyptians not only believed in multiple gods, but believed their pharaohs to be living gods. And this is a theme within Judaism and the oppression of the Jewish people, which is that there is often coexistence between Jews and whatever group that they are living with or under. But when the Jews are asked to do something that would honor another god, which could include paying taxes that go to building a temple in honor of a god, or in Egypt's case, the pharaoh who's considered a living god, Jews are going to refuse to do this because it goes against their religion. So over time, there is more tension between the Jews living in Egypt and the Egyptian authorities. And this is where Moses comes in. So the prophet Moses begins to lead the Israelites, or the Jews, out of Egypt. And in the process of doing so, he receives revelations from God, namely the 10 Commandments. And I, of course, need to note there are many miracles associated with what's called the Exodus, or the Jewish flight from Egypt, which includes the parting of the Red Sea. And we can chat about some of those miracles and the events and how science is often hell-bent on disproving these things. But we can talk about that when we're together. But the Ten Commandments is another covenant that Moses enters into, because the Ten Commandments are revealed to Moses at a time of doubt, when some of the Jews, because they begin to, and I'll show you this, they begin to wander through the Sinai Peninsula for years, for decades, and they begin to lose some faith. And when that begins to happen, God reveals himself in the form of a burning bush to give these rules and guidance to the Jews, to give them strength, and to just kind of focus them on their efforts again. Before we talk about the Ten Commandments, it's important to note that Jews, Christians, and Muslims all believe in and are supposed to honor the Ten Commandments. So again, we're going to see a lot of commonalities between these Abrahamic faiths because they share a lot of history and tradition. So these are the Ten Commandments. Just kind of know the basics of them. You don't have to have them memorized like I did in Catholic school. I'll just point out a couple of these because others are very universal. But the first one, thou shalt have no other gods before me, is that emphasis of monotheism, which is so central to Judaism. And again, it's often what initially gets the Jewish populations and then eventually the Christian and Muslim populations into a lot of trouble with other groups of people. The second is thou shalt not make unto thee any graven images, meaning you should have no idols of God, right? You shouldn't make any idols of God that are worshipped or that could be destroyed, which would be deeply disrespectful to God. So the idea of having idol worship is very controversial in these faiths, and you shouldn't do it. Thou shalt not take the Lord's name in vain. Which means that, sometimes it can be seen as like very basic. So use God's name when you're actually cursing. Or you shouldn't write God's name in any type of way that could be defamed. And the other one that I will highlight here is to remember the Sabbath. And so having Shabbos, or a Sabbath day in which you worship and meditate on your religion, is central in all of these faiths. What day it is may shift. For Christianity, it's Sunday. For Judaism and Islam, it's Friday into Saturday. So it's a little different, but the idea of having a particular Sabbath is central. So I want to talk a little bit more about the history before we kind of wrap up with some of the central books and some other concepts, because the history of the Jewish population is interwoven with their faith. So many holidays are tied to what the Jews have gone through. Because in the first more than half of their history, they are nomadic, they're living under other governments, which is why the story of King David is very important. So around 1020 BCE, King David helps to found the kingdom of Israel. So after the Jewish populations migrate back to the Middle East and also begin to settle back with populations that had not moved to Egypt, King David emerges from that lineage that comes from Sarah and Abraham. And he is able to unite the various tribes of Israel that had not been cohesive into one kingdom. For those who are not aware, the very famous Michelangelo's statue of David is based on King David of Israel, and specifically the story of David and Goliath. If you're unfamiliar with that story, the basic rundown is that David was pitted up against a giant Goliath, right, who was, evil and a tyrant. And even though Goliath was huge and David, by comparison, was much smaller, David was able to take down Goliath by casting a rock at like the most perfect spot on his head and took him down. Most likely the story did not happen exactly like that, but instead is an allegory of the war between the Phoenicians, who were a very powerful group in the region and who originally occupied what we know as the Kingdom of Israel today, or back then, and the Hebrews, right, or the army that King David was leading. And it's an appropriate allegory because the Hebrew military was very small and pretty scrappy, and the Phoenicians were really strong. And by beating the Phoenicians, they were able to take all of that territory and finally establish a kingdom in which the majority of the Jewish populations were settled and under one government for the first time in their history. So as I said, King David unites these Hebrew tribes, and we get the kingdom of Israel that looks like this, right? So they're missing a lot of coastal area. They have some, but the most important thing is that they are united. Another notable king is King Solomon. King Solomon is notable because he builds the city of Jerusalem. He also had a reputation for being a very fair and wise king. There are lots of stories about King Solomon. The most famous story is probably that of the fight between two women who claimed the same baby. Again, real quick, the story is that two women claimed the same child, right? They came to Solomon saying, they were holding up this one infant, and the one woman was claiming to be the mother, and the other one was also claiming to be the mother, and we know that that's not biologically possible. And so King Solomon, in his wisdom, said, okay, well, there's only one way this can be resolved. We'll just cut the baby in half. And by doing that, you can have one half of the baby, and then you have the other half, and everybody wins. And the one woman responded like, okay, like she was fine with it. And the other woman was horrified and said, no, don't cut the baby in half. I'd rather she have the baby and it live than I not have the baby and it die. And then King Solomon ruled that the woman who was willing to give up the child must have been the true mother, since she was so selfless and just simply wanted the safety of her child. Right? So there's stories like that that are very important. Historically, however, King Solomon ruled over a very difficult time. There were outside forces that were threatening to take over. And as a result of that, it was very important to King Solomon that he fortify the kingdom. So through heavy taxation and often forced labor, he built Jerusalem and walled up Jerusalem and some other parts of the kingdom. But because of this, it did lead to tension and rebellion, which leads to the split of Israel in 930 in civil war, in 930 BCE, we're still talking, and makes Israel very vulnerable to attack. And so even though it lasts for, about, not very long at all, really, 100 or so years, this moment is very culturally important to the Jews, right, but very short-lived. Because after this, what happens is that we have multiple empires that sweep in through this region. And since, again, the Jews were monotheistic and would refuse to honor the Assyrian gods or the Roman gods, they were often persecuted. And eventually, there were multiple waves of what are called diaspora, which means a forced scattering of people. So due to many legal decrees, right, the Jews were banished from the region. So diaspora is a migratory pattern that we will see pop up multiple times in history. And diaspora is not voluntary migration. The diaspora often results from war or some sort of human rights issue that causes people to flee. And because they're just trying to get away from something dangerous, they often flee all over the place. So the diaspora is why, after this moment, and at least until the 20th century, Jewish populations will live in minority groups scattered throughout the world. There are three major kind of migrations and like ethnic groupings of Jews who settle in certain regions, plus some other independent groups. So I do want to make us aware of these terms because you might have heard them but not have known what they meant. So the three major migrations that become three major ethnic groupings of Jews include the Ashkenazis. So the Ashkenazi Jews are the Jews who migrated to Germanic regions. So they were moving to literally like Germany and France and other parts of like Eastern Europe. The term Sephardic Jews refers to the Jews who moved to Spain and North Africa. It can also refer to Jews who moved to places like Turkey. Mizrahi Jews means Eastern Jews, and specifically refers to those who stayed in what we know as the Middle East and went so far as parts of Afghanistan and India today. There are other groups of Jews that live in very small populations in like China, believe it or not, and parts of India. We'll touch upon this in other points of the year. We will eventually do a deeper dive into Ethiopian Jews because they are a very interesting culture, and it's important to recognize that. And then I think lastly is taking a quick look at the holy books and the other books that provide guidance to Jewish populations. So the first of these is the Torah. So as it says here, in the narrowest sense, the Torah are the first five books of the Bible. So it starts like with Genesis, which I'll talk a little bit more about what Genesis is about in the next video for Christianity. Includes those first five books. So there is history there. There's some Jewish law there. The Torah was given to Moses in written form with oral commentary. The Talmud is another very important book. It's considered oral tradition that coincides with the Torah, and it has a lot of information that serves as the foundation for Jewish civil and canonical law. It's voluminous, right? 63 volumes here. And essentially, it tries to make the Torah more manageable for people, so people can figure out how to apply the Torah to everyday lives. Excuse me again. Rabbis spend a ton of time, right, using the Talmud, right, to make the Jewish religion more understandable, right, to the common practitioner. The Kabbalah, I just simply want to at least make you aware of it. The Kabbalah is a collection of writings that gets more into the mystical and super spiritual side of Judaism. Because since Judaism is oftentimes a pretty practical religion, sometimes people want more. And so the Kabbalah is part of this mysterious and mystical school. And we'll see that many religions have a mystical school to them that might not be really populous, but can really add to the culture of that religion. All right, we'll stop here for now, and we'll chat more about all of this together in class.